Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you so much for accommodating me. I really wish I could be there in person. As Brian said, last week I was working as a postdoctoral research associate with Direct Woodwell, and this week I just started my new job as a professor here at the University of Florida. So glad that I've been able to join you all via the internet. So as Brian mentioned, over the last 6 years I've been working at the University of Nebraska studying wildfire patterns and outcomes, and that's what I'd really like to talk to you all about today. So headlines like this one have been filling our news feeds for decades now. We've heard about large wildfires increasing and wreaking havoc across western U.S. forests, like in California. But many of us don't really associate these types of headlines with regions like Nebraska or the Great Plains, where wildfires haven't been as common over the last century. In fact, a lot of people that I was talking to in the general public, I tell them about my research on wildfire in the Great Plains, and they'd ask me, why are you studying that? Because they just didn't associate this region with large wildfires. But this fire season may have changed some minds. We've seen numerous wildfires popping up across Nebraska and other regions of the Great Plains, and this is causing places like Nebraska to make national headlines for these types of wildfires. So what I want to talk about today is what's going on with wildfires here in the Great Plains. Now, despite what a lot of people think about wildfires kind of being associated with western forested areas, wildfires are actually very common in rangeland systems like the Great Plains. In fact, the majority of large wildfires in the Great Plains in the U.S. that burned between 1984 and 2019 actually burned in rangeland systems. So 95% of all large wildfires that burned over this time period burned rangelands. 54% of those wildfires were dominated by rangeland. So over 50% of the perimeter was composed of rangeland. And 52% of the over 118 million acres burned by large wildfires were in rangeland systems. So it's definitely time that we start resetting this perspective of where wildfires are burning. They're definitely common in rangeland systems. So back in 2017, myself, along with Drs. Carissa Wonka and Direct Woodwell, published an article showing increasing wildfire activity here in the Great Plains. We found between 1984 and 2014 that area burned by large wildfires increased by over 400%. And during the same time period, wildfire number increased by 350%. So, this wildfire season that we're seeing is kind of matching some of these trends. Now, when we looked at where these increases are occurring geographically, you can see that they are largely occurring in the western and central Great Plains. So in the map that I'm showing here, we're looking at the increase in wildfire number and area burned, where the darker red is indicating a greater increase. You can see regions like the Nebraska Sandhills, we're having more moderate increases in wildfire number and area burned, whereas some of these western portions of Nebraska and Kansas are seeing some of the greatest increases in area burned and wildfire number. So what I want to talk to you today, I kind of want to break it down into three pieces. I want to talk about first where we've been, so looking at fire history in the Great Plains. Then I want to talk about where we are now, specifically what are some of the potential drivers of these large wildfire increases, and what are some of the outcomes that we're seeing from these large wildfires on rangeland ecosystems. And then finally, I want to talk about where we can go. So what can we do about this? So we'll start off here where we've been. For over 10,000 years, fire is frequent as every year burned large areas in the Great Plains. In fact, this region was one of the most frequently burned regions in the United States. So in this map here, these different colors that you're seeing represent mean fire return interval, and the darker the orange color, the more frequent the fire. And I've just outlined, you can see the Great Plains here outlined in gray. And so you can see that we had very frequent fire return intervals in the southern Great Plains up to less than 2 years, a return interval of less than every 2 years. And these fires were started by both lightning fires as well as fires stewarded by Native Americans. And they large areas, and this generated complex structures and diversity across the Great Plains. And so many of the ecological communities and systems that we know today are fundamentally shaped by these frequent fires. And in fact, it's really clear that fires played a key role in the dominance of grasslands across many regions globally. So when we go all the way back in time to where grasslands actually began spreading across the earth millions of years ago, this spread actually coincides with major increases in fire occurrence. So this plot is looking at the relative charcoal flux in ocean sediment, which just means fire occurrence a really long time ago. Excuse me. And what you can see here is we have this big spike in fire occurrence that happened around 10 million years ago, and this coincides with this major spread in grassland and savanna systems across the globe. And it's actually now well established in the scientific literature that the existence of many of our grasslands is dependent on fire occurrence. Now, we generally talk about this dependence in terms of a grass fire cycle. So fire in an area prevents trees and shrubs from establishing, and this allows grasses to move into that area. Grasses are made up of very fine fuels, so they burn easily. Sorry, I've got a bit of a cold, so I'm just battling through here. And so these fine fuels then promote more frequent fire, and these fires continue to prevent trees and shrubs from establishing, and so we get this feedback where we see persistence of grasslands with fire. So it makes sense that large continuous grasslands like the Great Plains experience frequent fire in order to promote their existence. However, when Europeans settled in the United States, they displaced Native Americans from their land. This means that Native American fire stewardship that helped promote frequent fires was eliminated. With some exceptions, of course, we can talk about the Flint Hills, for instance. We also saw this shift towards fire suppression activities, where when fires do occur, there was this immediate effort to suppress them. And so this caused this rapid shift in fire culture, where we saw fire almost completely eliminated from the Great Plains. And this led to this region really being considered low risk for wildfire. And you can see that in this map here from the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy, where the red areas are showing areas considered high risk for large wildfires. So you can see I've outlined the Great Plains here in black, that we are generally considered low risk. And if we actually look at the distribution of wildfire across the United States in even the 80s and 90s, we can see that the wildfires were not occurring that frequently here. So in this map, these yellow dots indicate large wildfire occurrence. These red and orange dots are just showing kind of more extreme wildfires. And what you can see is that, there weren't a ton of wildfires occurring relative to the western United States. But when we look into the 2000s, we see that really isn't the case anymore. As I mentioned at the start of the talk, wildfires are increasing in the Great Plains, and you can see this increase in wildfire occurrence compared to just a few decades ago when we look at these maps here. So just to sum up where we've been, fire and grasslands are highly intertwined by this grass fire cycle. The Great Plains was historically frequently burned until Euro-American settlement, which is where we've gotten this perception of low risk for fire in the Great Plains. And suppression has kind of completely eradicated fire for almost the last century, of course, until recently. So this really leads well into where are we now. As I mentioned, area burned and wildfire number are increasing here in the Great Plains. And so I want to talk about what might be driving some of these trends. Now, there are three factors that we need in order to have a fire. We need ignition to start the fire. We need fuel for that fire to burn. And then we also need weather and climatic conditions that are conducive to fire. So I just want to go through each of these factors and talk about how they're impacting or potentially impacting wildfire patterns in the Great Plains. So let's start off by talking about ignitions. Now, as I mentioned, ignitions in the Great Plains can come from both lightning as well as human sources like campfires, cars, fireworks. And research into ignition sources for wildfires across the United States has found that unintentional human ignitions are a major driver of wildfires. In fact, 88% of wildfires in the Great Plains are human started. And if you look at this plot here, and I apologize for the size, it's just as big as I could make it from the manuscript I took it from. But in this plot here, we're looking at the frequency of wildfires relative to time of year. So these are the letters are representing the month. And then we've got human-caused wildfires plotted in red versus lightning fires plotted in blue. So you can see here that lightning-started fires are really restricted to June, July, and August, whereas caused fires are really spreading these wildfires throughout the course of a year. And you can also see, I just like to point out this large peak in wildfire occurrence that happens right around the end of June, start of July. This actually lines up pretty nicely with our 4th of July celebration. It just gives you an idea about the huge impact that our activities can have on driving wildfire activities. Now, human ignitions, wildfires caused by human ignitions were most common in the eastern parts of the Great Plains. So in this map, what we're looking at here is the redder the circle, the greater percentage of wildfires were started by human ignition. So in the eastern portions of the Great Plains, you can see that it's majority human-started ignitions, whereas in the western portions, we're seeing sort of a mixture between lightning and human ignitions. Now, if you recall, I mentioned that our wildfires were increasing most greatly in the western portions, western and kind of central south portions of the Great Plains. And so we can see that it's both lightning and human-started ignitions that are likely driving these. Now, another factor we have to consider is climate and weather. So when we look at large wildfires that burned across the Great Plains between 2000 and 2012, we can see that they tend to be associated with dry or drought conditions. So in this map, I just color-coded wildfire perimeters based on their PDSI, or Palmer Drought Severity Index, where the redder the color, the more extreme the drought condition. And so you can see that kind of these moderate and severe drought conditions are where we're seeing a lot of wildfires, particularly in the western Great Plains, whereas, like in the Tall Timbers area, in the eastern portion of the Great Plains, we're seeing fires occurring under these near normal and moist conditions more frequently. And you can really get an idea here of the relationship between drought condition and fire when we plot this out in a frequency distribution. So everything to the left of this line here is showing us fires that are burning under drier conditions. And so you can see, the majority of our wildfires burn under more severe drought. This probably isn't surprising to anyone who's lit a fire before. It's much easier to light a fire on something that's dry than it is to light something that's wet. This becomes extremely important for us, particularly as we continue to see warmer and conditions here in the Great Plains with climate change. Finally, we need to talk about fuels. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this section because this is where I spend a lot of time on my research. So my colleagues and I wanted to determine where large wildfires were burning relative to different fuel types in the Great Plains. And we looked at large wildfires that burned between 1993 and 2014. And we wanted to see whether herbaceous fuels, woody vegetation, crops, pasture hayfields, or developed areas had a greater propensity for large wildfires. So do they have a higher wildfire risk? And so in this plot, what we're looking at here is large wildfire risk where the negative values indicate. And you can see that really nicely in this picture that was taken by Drac Twidwell. This is the fire burning under the exact same conditions, and you can see the flame lengths that are occurring here in the grassland versus when we burn the cedar trees. Now, woody vegetation doesn't just impact flame lengths, it also impacts things like maximum spotting distance. This is when embers escape a fire and they're lofted up into a new location where they can start a completely new fire. And this makes containing and suppressing fires a lot more difficult. And these lofting embers are actually a #1 cause of home destruction during wildfires because they land on roofs and set the home alight. So we actually use wildfire behavior models to look at differences in maximum spot fire distance As we shifted from a grassland, which I've got plotted here in yellow, compared to an encroached grassland plotted in orange and a woodland plotted in red. And so we're looking at this maximum spot fire distance relative to wind speed, where we would expect, with increasing wind speed, we're going to see the wind can push those embers farther away. And what you find is that consistently grasslands have a much lower maximum spot fire distance than when we have encroached grasslands and woodlands. Excuse me. So we think these factors play a key role in why we're seeing more large wildfires occurring in woody vegetation. Now, unfortunately, as I mentioned, our push to eliminate fire has also removed this grass fire cycle from the Great Plains that was preventing woody vegetation from moving into our grasslands. And so we're seeing, and this could be feeding back. It's feeding back into this growing number of wildfires in the Great Plains. So in this plot, you're looking at tree cover in acres relative to time, so the year 1984 to 2020. And you can see that we've had an increase here of over 20 million acres in just trees alone in the Great Plains. And this isn't even including shrub encroachment. Now, these trends are occurring across numerous different landscapes, even those that we're specifically targeting with conservation. So this was a study conducted by Dylan Fogarty, where he was tracking changes in woody cover across Nebraska's conservation landscapes. And in the map here, the red areas are where we've seen an increase in woody cover between 2000 and 2017. The blue areas are where we're seeing losses, and you can see those are kind of concentrated in our forested areas in the Pine Ridge and Niobrara, where we associate these primarily with wildfire occurrence. And then our conservation landscapes are outlined here in black in this map. And so I know these plots are really small, but all I really want you to get out of them here is that when we looked at trends across these different conservation landscapes, we saw in almost every instance that we were seeing increases in woody cover over this time period. Now, woody encroachment is not just limited to the expansion from where trees were historically distributed. It's also proliferating from things like tree plantings that we're putting into our rangelands as well. So we looked at the spread of eastern red cedar from 50 windbreaks across the Nebraska sandhills, and we found that about 25% of them had established eastern red cedar spread. So these are the types of images. We were just using satellite imagery. So this was spread that was established enough that we could see it from satellite images. So this is increasing risks, particularly around homes and buildings where we use some of these windbreaks. So just to sum this portion up of where we are now, we know wildfires are increasing and they're likely tied to increasingly dry conditions, changes in fuels, primarily woody encroachment, combined with the many opportunities for ignition through growing human ignition. So what exactly are the outcomes of these wildfires? That's the next thing I'd like to touch on here quickly. Now, in rangeland systems, there's a lot of concern about post-fire vegetation recovery, particularly when wildfires are burning during drier or drought conditions. There's a fear that wildfire is going to lead to desertification or an increase in bare ground and, of course, hurt forage production. So we wanted to track vegetation recovery across wildfires in the Great Plains. So I plotted out here in this map all the wildfires that we assessed. I think this was between 2000 and 2012. And what we wanted to see was how vegetation was recovering following these wildfires. So in these plots here, what we're looking at is a change in mean cover for perennial forbs and grasses at the top and food ground here at the bottom, relative to time since fire. And these red bars here represent the year that the fire occurred. So we looked at 10 years vegetation cover before the wildfire occurred, and that's what we used to create this gray bars here, which gave us a pre-fire range of variation. So basically, what were the conditions of cover for perennial forbs and grasses and bare ground before the wildfire occurred? And then we wanted to see if after the wildfire, is vegetation returning to those pre-fire conditions? And so you can see pretty clearly here, perennial forbs and grasses, we see this sharp decrease at the year of the wildfire, but almost immediately we return to our pre-fire range of variation and we see rapid recovery. And this is for all wildfires. This is average for all wildfires in the Great Plains. Similarly, for bare ground, we see a spike in bare ground cover at the time of wildfire, but again, we see almost immediate recovery back to this pre-fire range of variation within a year or two. And when we broke this down and looked at different drought conditions, we saw the same thing. So I know these plots are a little busy, but what we're looking at here is I've plotted out different lines that are color-coded based on these drought conditions. So the red, orange, and yellow lines are wildfire impact to cover for fires that burned under moderate, severe, and extreme drought. You can see that we have greater declines in perennial form and grass cover immediately following the wildfire, but again, we see rapid recovery in these fires as well. And the same goes when we look at bare ground. We broke perennial form and grass cover down by each of our ecoregions in the Great Plains, and across all ecoregions, we saw the same thing, either rapid recovery for the pre-fire range of variation, or we didn't even see a change outside of that pre-fire range of variation. And when we went down even further to a lower scale and looked at individual wildfires, we saw this as well. So when we zoomed in on the Nebraska sandhills, which we expect to be a little bit more sensitive to wildfires, particularly during drought, we still saw rapid recovery. So this is a Region 24 complex fire that burned in 2012 under some extreme drought conditions, and you can see here rapid recovery of our perennial forests and grass. Rangeland ecosystem, it really just lies with human lives and property. So between 2011 and 2016, wildfires resulted in a loss of 162 human lives, $3.5 billion in property and crop damage, and $12.4 billion in suppression costs across the United States. So where are we now? Human ignition, drier conditions, and a buildup of fuels, primarily woody encroachment, are contributing to increasing wildfires in the Great Plains. Wildfires aren't driving a loss in rangeland vegetation, but they are a real threat to human life and property, and that's something we need to plan for in the future. So where can we go from here? It's kind of the last chunk of my talk. It's clear that removing fire from grasslands doesn't work. That's what we've been trying over the last century, and we're seeing the results of that now. We've seen huge amounts of woody encroachment, and we're seeing this rapid increase in wildfires in the Great Plains. We also know that the Great Plains is predicted to continue to get warmer and drier in the near future. So these are maps that I've taken from the 2014 National Climate Assessment. The map on the left, we're looking at an increase in the number of hot days. You can see the scale bar down here. So the darker red areas show a greater increase in the number of hot days by mid-century, so 2050. And so you can see particularly along these western and southern regions of the Great Plains, we're going to see an increase in the number of hot days, which is where we're already seeing our greatest increases in wildfire. Similarly, if we look at the increase in the number of consecutive dry days, we're seeing the darker brown areas are showing where we have a greater increase in the number of consecutive dry days. And so you can see here the western portions and southern portions of the Great Plains, we're seeing more dry conditions. So we know that these conditions could exacerbate wildfire activity. We also know that woody encroachment is going to continue if it's left unchecked. So this is a map that was taken from the Central Grasslands Roadmap, and it's looking at grasslands that are at risk. So the purple areas are places that grasslands have already been plowed or encroached. And then these yellow areas are showing places that are predicted to be at risk. And the majority of the central and southern Great Plains in these areas are places that are at risk from woody encroachment. We're also seeing programs continue to promote the planting of eastern red cedar windbreaks and shelter belts across regions in the central and northern Great Plains, and so we expect continued encroachment from those in the future as well. So what are we going to do about it? Well, it might be cliche at this point, but we can fight fire with fire by embracing prescribed fire as a tool that can help to sustain our grasslands and decrease wildfire risk. So prescribed fire allows us to reintroduce this grass fire cycle into our system without the risk that large wildfires pose. We can plan these fires ahead to make sure that there's safe grassland management in order to reduce our herbaceous fuel loads and prevent woody encroachment, as well as have a number of other benefits for things like rangeland biodiversity. We can also use prescribed fires to restore areas that have been invaded by trees as well. And this is a much more economical and safer approach than things like mechanical tree removal. Here's an image of a prescribed fire that's being used to burn a patch of cedar trees. And I want to just take a few minutes to talk about the Les Canyons of Nebraska as an example for utilizing prescribed fire to restore grasslands that have been invaded by eastern red cedar. And this region is, in this region, the Les Canyons Rangeland Alliance has been applying prescribed fire to restore their rangeland. So I want to return to this study that was conducted by Dylan Fogarty, and we're just going to zoom in on the Les Canyons area, which is outlined here in gray. So recall that all of these red areas here are areas where we're seeing increases in cover, and the blue areas are where we're seeing decreases in cover. The black perimeters here are the places where the Les Canyons Rangeland Alliance has implemented prescribed burns. And so you can see just from this map the effectiveness of these burns at removing and preventing woody encroachment. And when we look specifically at the changes in woody cover through time in the Les Canyons, you can see just in our data in the last 5 years or so, we see this plateau in woody cover that's occurring, and we attribute this to the application of prescribed fires. Now, a number of students out of Drax Lab have conducted assessments on these fires, post-fire, to look at recovery of the rangeland system following the removal of these woodlands. And so these plots are taken from a study led by Christine Bilski, and she was tracking the changes in herbaceous biomass following fire in woodlands that were burned, so areas that have been encroached by cedars that we were trying to return, or the Rangeland Alliance was trying to return to rangeland, and then burn grasslands in these prescribed fires as well. So these green lines are looking at the change in total herbaceous biomass relative to time since fire here. And then what we're looking at on the side here, these plots are, this plot is looking at the total herbaceous biomass in an unburned woodland. You can see very little. And this plot is looking at the total herbaceous biomass in an unburned grassland. And so what you can see is, even a year post-fire, we're already seeing levels that are about equivalent to this unburned grassland following these restoration treatments with prescribed fire. And you can see our grasslands that are burned are similarly unaffected. So these high-intensity prescribed burns are able to return herbaceous biomass to encroached sites. They're also able to return species richness. So this is a study conducted by Allison Ludwig, who's a master's student in Drax Lab. And if you look at the mean species richness in a woodland versus a grassland, you can see obviously woodlands have much lower species richness, but following these treatments, you see burned woodlands have very similar species richness to burned grasslands and unburned grasslands. Now, not only do these prescribed fires decrease woody cover and restore our grasslands, they also have a much lower risk than if we were to wait for a wildfire to burn these same areas, which we know at this point, wildfires are becoming inevitable in this location, or in the Great Plains region. So we looked at maximum spot fire distance again, which, as I mentioned, is the distance over which a lofted ember from a fire can travel and potentially start a new fire that we need to try to contain and suppress. And so when we look at maximum spot fire distances, again, we're looking at grasslands in yellow, encroached grasslands in orange, and woodlands in red. You can see that our prescribed fire conditions have a much lower maximum spot fire distance than our wildfire conditions. So these are much safer, our prescribed fires are much safer than if we just were to wait for a wildfire to occur. So I think it's clear that these prescribed fires can greatly reduce wildfire risk and improve our rangeland conditions. Now, I also want to note a study by Dylan Fogarty that was conducted in 2021. He was looking at cedar reestablishment following these fires, and what he found found is that he could find cedar seedlings reestablishing about 1 to 2 years post-fire. And this makes sense considering that a lot of these areas are highly encroached with cedar, and so there's a lot of sources for new propagules to come in and for cedar to reestablish. And so what this just highlights to us is that prescribed fires need to be repeated regularly in order to maintain rangelands, and it fits with that history we talked about of frequent fire in rangeland systems. So where can we go? Getting more prescribed fire on the ground will be key to reducing our wildfire risk and to better coexisting with fire in this system, as was done for thousands of years before European settlement. This will really require us to change our perceptions of fire in the Great Plains. Not all fire is dangerous fire. Prescribed fires can be used as a safe and helpful tool. That said, we also need to acknowledge that the Great Plains is not an oasis from fire. Despite what, past trends might have suggested, wildfires are going to happen here, and we do need to be prepared for wildfire at the same time. So I just want to touch on quickly things we can do to protect ourselves from wildfire. We can create defensible space around our homes and buildings, excuse me, by clearing out fuels immediately around our buildings, as well as creating a buffer zone around them where things like prescribed fire could be used to help reduce fuel buildup. We can also create more fire-resistant homes and buildings that are less likely to catch fire. For instance, replacing wood or shingle roofs with things like metal that are much less likely to catch fire. Remember, as I mentioned, those lofted embers are the #1 cause of home destruction during a wildfire. And so if we've got a metal roof that's much less likely to burn, it's going to protect our home. And finally, we need to understand that we also might need to evacuate during a wildfire, and so we need to have supplies and evacuation routes ready for our departure. There are a number of resources that are available at different locations, so I encourage everyone to check out resources available for wherever you live specifically. This is just an example for the Nebraska Wildfire Risk Assessment Portal hosted by the Nebraska Forest Service. So to sum up my talk, what's going on with wildfire in the Great Plains? Well, where have we been? We know that fire is an integral part of Great Plains landscapes, and that the Great Plains is actually one of the most frequently burned areas in the United States because of both lightning fires and highly flammable grasslands, as well as fires stewarded by indigenous people for thousands of years. We know that removing fire from the Great Plains has led to a large amount of woody encroachment, and in combination with other factors like drier conditions and increased ignition sources, this is leading to a large increase in wildfires. Now, while wildfires are not having destructive impacts to our rangeland ecosystems, they are a real threat to human life and property. What can we do? We need to change our perception of fire here in the Great Plains, and reintroducing fire into the Great Plains using prescribed fire will help to greatly reduce wildfire risk, as well as have huge economic and ecological benefits. And we also need to acknowledge that wildfires can still happen here, and we need to be prepared for them when they come. With that, I'd just like to say again, thank you so much for allowing me to attend virtually. Again, I really wish I could have been there in person, but I'm happy to answer any questions if I have time, and if not, my email is listed up here. Please feel free to email me any questions that you might have. Thank you.